ask Nassim Washoe, the Policy Director of the ACLU, to come up and welcome us.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Nassim Washoe and I'm the Policy Director of the ACLU. Can you hear me? No? Do we have a microphone? I have a hard time speaking. Okay, I'm the, is this on? You may have to zip it up. I'm just going to sing. Is this louder? Yes. Okay. I'm the Policy Director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia, and it's an honor to be here with everyone tonight, and I'm just as eager to hear from our panel of experts as you are, so I'll keep my remarks short, but I just wanted to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the ACLU DC. The ACLU DC is the local affiliate of the ACLU. For those of you who may not be familiar with the structure of the ACLU, in addition to the national ACLU, and where we are today as part of the national ACLU, the ACLU also has affiliate offices in every state, in Puerto Rico, and in the District of Columbia. I've been trying to figure out how to transfer to the Puerto Rico office ever since I learned this. I've only worked here a short time. So in DC, we have a staff of about 10 people. We're a small staff, and like all the other affiliates, we focus our efforts on the actions of our local government. And we work through litigation, through legislative advocacy, and through public education to protect and further civil rights and civil liberties for all who work, who live, and who visit the district. Our priority areas right now include immigration rights, but they also include criminal justice reform, everything from policing to reentry. They include First Amendment rights. As you can imagine, we get a lot of First Amendment activity here in the district, and we've actually created a Know Your Rights pamphlet on demonstrations that's specific to the district, which I would love and be happy to share with all of you. Other policy issue areas include government surveillance, privacy, and federal workers' rights because of where we are in the district. But we work on a whole host of issues. And the main reason I'm up here right now is because I want you to know that we want to be a resource to you. We are your local ACLU. And so if you live in the district, if you operate in the district, and you have questions, you have concerns, we want you to reach out to us. And in addition to any legal questions we might be able to answer, we also have a lot of public education resources, so we'd be happy to come and do a training or workshop with your members or anyone in your community about different issues that impact your community. Because I'm the policy director, I love to get people involved in doing local advocacy, so that's another thing we'd love to engage you on. And we actually have a training on the DC government structure and how to advocate locally on issues that you care about. And essentially, that's it. I want to be a resource to you. I hope to get to chat with many more of you after the panel. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sush.
Thank you very much. Grab this, put it back into place. Any idea how to do this? Push it down. Just push. Ring the microphone. Okay. Now I would turn it back on. Okay, welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Yeah. Okay. I'm Suresh Shahabi. I used to be an attorney at the Department of Justice, United States Department of Justice. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of PAAIA and its affiliated PAC, the Iranian American Political Action Committee, as well as the IA 100, and I used to serve for many years on the board of the IABA. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you to the ACLU for hosting us. We have a distinguished panel today, including Abdi Soltani, who's a nationally recognized civil rights leader who's dedicated his adult life to social justice and equal treatment for all. As the Executive Director of the ACLU's Northern California office since 2009, Abdi has been fighting for civil liberties, including racial, gender, and economic justice, and helping the ACLU to defend and advance civil liberties across the country. We also have Manir Wahid on the panel today. She joined the ACLU in March of 2017 as the Legislative and Advocacy Council, and she works at the intersection of issues impacting Muslims, Arabs, Middle Easterners, and South Asian communities, including on immigration, national security, and counterterrorism, and hate violence and bullying. To my right is Cyrus Mehri, who is the founding partner of Mehri and Scalit. He litigates cases involving discrimination, civil and consumer rights, and corporate fraud. And he has led some of the largest and most significant race and gender cases in U.S. history, and is lead counsel for a coalition of Iranian American organizations, including the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans and 3 others, and IABA, challenging the discriminatory travel ban in federal court in D.C. Finally, we have Ali Rahnaman, who is a civil rights attorney as well, and a social justice advocate who litigates cases involving civil and consumer rights, corporate fraud, discrimination, and government misconduct. He serves on the board of the Iranian American Bar Association of D.C. and is the director of their legal services. Thank you all for coming today. The topic today is an overview. We're going to start with an overview of constitutional and statutory safeguards against discrimination in the United States. We'll speak then a bit about the role of organizations like the ACLU and IABA and PAAIA and others in safeguarding civil rights for Iranian Americans, how we can collaborate further as well. We'll then delve into the experience of some of the other minority groups and how they gained recognition as an indispensable part of American society, their efforts in defending their civil rights against hate crimes and discrimination, and supporting other minorities in return, strengthening their position. Finally, we will hit on the Iranian American response and experience after the travel ban, and the achievements and the lessons learned, and then open it up for a Q&A. So having said that, I'm going to ask Abdi to kick it off and tell us a little bit about the safeguards built into the American legal jurisprudence system against discriminatory treatment of minorities, such as Iranian Americans. And if you could just take us through some of the historical developments, Abdi, in constitutional law, and what Iranian Americans should understand about the protections provided from this great country.
Well, I want to thank everybody for spending your Monday evening with us, and I understand that we're live streaming this through both PAAIA and IABA, so I want to welcome everybody who's watching us on the live stream. Just as we began with Nassim talking about the ACLU here in Washington, D.C., as she mentioned, there is an ACLU in every state. And so for those of you who are in the room, your family members who live both in the metropolitan D.C. area of Virginia or Maryland, but also in every state of this country, there's an ACLU office that we welcome the Iranian American community to be in contact with the ACLU in your home states so we can build a stronger relationship between the ACLU and Iranian Americans throughout the country. And the reason that that's important is I think that the events of the last few months have really made the Iranian American community much, much more aware, both of the rights that we have, but also how those rights can be taken away from us. And because of our national origin being the country of Iran that has a lot of foreign policy issues with the United States, and by virtue that many Iranians, though not all, are Muslim, and the fact that we're Middle Eastern, Iranian Americans need to be very alert to protecting our rights every day, every year, and under every administration, and most definitely under the current administration. So I travel now everywhere with my pocket Constitution of the United States. And I really want to just emphasize 3 really important phases of United States history and how it relates to Iranian Americans. Ours is a fairly new diaspora to the United States. There have been Iranians who've come here for a very long time, but certainly our diaspora started after the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and probably the preceding student immigration in the 60s. But we're a fairly new community as part of the United States. So there's three really important markers in US history that are relevant to us. The first is the founding of the United States with the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution and the original Bill of Rights. And that original Bill of Rights has the First Amendment, which gives us the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly, that we can come together in rooms like this or in associations like PAAIA or IABA. And it's the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state that's also in the First Amendment. So those rights are essential. They're rights at the founding of this country. But I think as Iranian Americans, we also know that this country's founding also included slavery. And for a few hundred years in the early part of this country's origins, there were people who were not afforded the rights of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. In fact, people were treated as property, traded as slaves. And in particular, the histories of African Americans and in a different way, Native Americans were founding injustices that were also part of this history, and the exclusion of women from voting, for example. So that takes us to the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, which includes the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. I'm not going to take the time to read it, but I really urge every Iranian American to go and read the 14th Amendment, because that is what says that by virtue of being born here or being naturalized, we're citizens, and it also provides equal protection to every person, citizen and non-citizen alike. The word person is very important in the 14th Amendment. Following that period of the abolition of slavery, there was a brief period of Reconstruction where great advances in people's rights were made. But within 10 years, those rights, especially that were secured by African Americans, were begun to be taken away. And we had a century of what's known as Jim Crow, which was legalized segregation, which brought us to the Civil Rights Movement, brought us to the mass movement and the legal victories that created a lot of the protections for civil rights. Those protections that began in the 1960s are what afforded us a lot of the protections that we enjoy today. So, my main point to the Iranian American community is we have to embrace the values of this country at its founding. We have to respect the struggle of other communities who fought for the freedom and equality that gives us the foundation of our rights today. And we have to dedicate ourselves today to protecting those rights, both for ourselves as Iranian Americans, but for everyone who is going to face abuses of power or the violations of their rights. So that's why I'm so excited to be strengthening the relationship between the ACLU and the Iranian American community, because we can be a very important voice right now as defenders of these really important values and principles.
And I'll note that the ACLU was instrumental in one of the very first travel ban cases involving an Iraqi. I believe it was the Darwish case, which you won a victory right out of the box on. We're grateful to you for doing that. I'll make one comment. We forgot to mention the Fifth Amendment. Not that you can mention all of them, but it also protects against deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, and that is the key there. And the 14th and the 5th work together in a very nice way at times. Let me ask you, Cyrus, can you flesh out how the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and statutory laws like the 1952 and 65 Immigration and Naturalization Act provide safeguards against the discriminatory treatment of minorities, such as Iranian Americans?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me, and also want to build on what was just said about the U.S. Constitution and its amendments over time, which is such a great gift, not only to Americans, but for the whole world. And before I answer that, I just want to just say something about how proud I am about the Iranian American community and all our allies that stood up to the travel ban. That first weekend was an authoritarian moment, and we could have just rolled over, but instead hundreds of lawyers showed up at the airports, thousands of people showed up, and because of that, there was a concession to actually abide by the court system. So victories like the ACLU could be done. And I was proud to be part of a coalescing four Iranian American organizations: PARS Equality, NIAC, National Iranian American Council, PAAIA, who's represented here today, and IABA, and we worked in a united way. But there's a lot of heroes and heroines in this room and who are listening who were part of that first wave and the continuing effort to date. And part of our case that we call PARS Equality that was filed in federal court here in DC is building on, to answer your question, kind of a more, in addition to a civil liberties position on Establishment Clause, a national origin case on behalf of Iranian Americans, which draws on the Fifth Amendment, which borrows from the 14th Amendment, which is due process and equal protection. And if you look at the history of the INA, the immigration law, that for decades, this country excluded people of different ethnic origins in immigration. We excluded the Chinese for a long period of time. We excluded different ethnic groups that we had hostilities towards, and irrationally so. So that third burst of expanding rights that was just alluded to in the civil rights era, one of the greatest accomplishments of that era was amending the immigration laws to be much more inclusive of people from around the world, and to say that we're not going to discriminate based on national origin or religion or other backgrounds. So that set the stage for Iranian Americans to come to this country and contribute so much in the terms of job creation, innovation, research, science. You just go across the board. So I think that's a great part of American history, and luckily, as a community, we have stood up to protect that part of American history, and we have a lot to teach people because we appreciate the freedoms of this country like a lot of other recent immigrant groups do, in a more profound way in many respects. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I just wanted to get a few of those points out.
We'll go into greater detail in the second half of the panel, but I want to
Suresh, you should take the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
I just want to quickly move over to Manar, and then I'm going to ask Ali to tell us a little bit more about how IABA has been engaged. But Manar, can you tell us a little bit, just in terms of the experiences of other minority groups, like Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, and their fight for civil rights and against discrimination? Just give us a little background how we can learn from the struggles of others.
Sure. So I'm generally pretty loud. So I think there's a lot of patterns across communities of color, whether we're talking about Latinos or Asian American and Pacific Islanders, African American communities. I mean, we've seen it in our immigration system through, some of which has been talked about a little bit already, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented people from coming to this country. You hear in the news constantly reference to Japanese internment for fear that we're returning to a similar age. But I also think it's important for us to understand that there are similarities that are happening right now, and there are a lot of patterns in the way that the government is operating that we can use to help each other. So when we think about raids by ICE, by immigration enforcement, there's patterns in terms of who is being picked up, which is largely people of color, which is people in this room, people in this community, and people in a ton of other communities as well. But we can learn a lot from the experience of Latinos that have been targeted for raids for many years. Also in terms of checkpoints and stops, the way that people get stopped, the types of questions that they're asked. There's a lot of patterns in history in that as well. And then, local law enforcement with people of color being stopped by local law enforcement. The Know Your Rights materials that have been created, some of which are outside, but we have a ton more in that space, have been created for communities for an extended period of time, and there are differences and nuances now, not necessarily in terms of local law enforcement, but I think that we are seeing that, Arab, Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Iranian communities have dealt with the FBI for many years, but I think we'll see an expansion of that, and we'll see an increased frequency of that. We've already heard of the FBI showing up at people's houses. We've heard of immigration enforcement showing up at the houses of refugees, people who came here through a very strenuous process. So I think there's a lot of patterns through all of these systems that we can take and use the strategies that other communities of color have used and collaborate with them, because I think a lot of our safety and protection in this new environment is going to come at the local level, and it's going to come from protecting each other locally, much more so than at a federal level, to say the least. And then the last piece that I'll highlight, where I think we've seen a lot of patterns, though, I think since 9/11 we've seen a lot of hate crimes against Arab, Muslim, Iranian, South Asian, Middle Eastern communities. We definitely saw a spike after 9/11, and then, you know, those numbers really kind of never went down again, but they didn't go up until about 2 years ago after Paris and San Bernardino. And then they went up, and then after the election we saw an increase in hate crimes against African Americans and Latinos as well, with the increased anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment. And I definitely think, you know, I'm sure everyone in this room has stories of at least people they know that have dealt with harassment or attacks in an increasing way just in the last few months. So there's a lot of patterns, a lot to be learned from, and a lot, I think, of room for us to develop and collaborate together with other communities.
Thank you, Minar. Ali, I remember when I was serving on the Iranian American Bar Association back in the early days, shortly after 9/11, and IAPAC and IABA worked together preparing reports, documenting what happened to individuals as a result of the Enhanced Border Security Act and the End Sears program, where a number of Iranians were rounded up. And I'm curious what the, if you could tell us a little bit about how the IABA responded to the travel ban and your role in that.
First, I want to thank for everyone for coming. And what happened after the travel ban? What happened after the travel ban was that we felt like we're the first responders in a kind of way, that a tragedy is happening and then we have to go out to see what we can do. The first thing that came up was that we don't have enough information or data about people who are being affected from this travel ban. And very basically, we worked with a couple of other groups in the universities, and we tried to create the infrastructure, which does not exist and did not exist at the time, at least, to let people report the incidents that are happening around the country. So we wanted to know which airports are being affected by this travel ban more than the others. We wanted to know if people were turned around in the airports overseas, whether what's going on and how we can help. One of the things that helped us do was that we got information about people who have been led into the United States and the type of visa or immigration status they had. And because of that, we were able to use our resources by sending out lawyers to different airports, mostly five of the biggest airports: Boston, New York, DC, San Francisco, and LAX. And Iranian lawyers actually responded by going to the airports, and we were able to get the information in and try to get everyone out. One of the experiences we had, or I personally had with the other people on ABA in Dulles Airport here in DC, was that the first day after the travel ban was signed, we got to the airport and we asked other lawyers to come, and luckily 100 lawyers from DC area showed up. And we were not organized. And one of the things that IABA was able to do was to put forward all the infrastructure and ability it has to organize all the lawyers there and help with creating a new organization called Dulles Justice Center. The second day and third day and fourth day, we had a total of 700 names of lawyers who showed up at the airport. Wow. And I was amazed by that. When the travel ban happened, when the president signed the order, a lot of people felt disappointed at the system. But when we showed up at the airport and saw all these lawyers who came out and saw all the people who came out to support, and we saw how strong the civil society is in this country and how it's going to push back against the travel ban. So a couple of things. One is the infrastructure, and IABA is trying to create that infrastructure in a way that if such a thing happens in the future, we won't need to act on basic technology. The second thing is, in our experience, we need to work with other minorities. This is building on what Manar said. This travel ban disproportionately affected Iranians, yes. But other minority groups and other groups really helped us to fight against this travel ban. And I think we need to build on that in a way that other minority groups built on others' experiences. For example, Asian American community really built itself on by helping the Black American community during the civil rights movement. And we need to use that experience in a way that it can help us to distinguish ourselves. Also, we can use their experience and their support in fighting against the different type of discrimination that come up.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm particularly proud because when IABA was first started, a number of the board were adamant that it wouldn't be just a networking organization, but that we would engage in substantive matters. And to see how the next generations carry the torch makes me very, very proud.
Just want to add one thing. It got to a point that at the fourth day, we started with no infrastructure. On the fourth day, we had people reporting names of people getting on the airplane in Iran and other countries, and we would give those names to our lawyers in different airports and check people in when they got into the United States.
Wow.
I'm very proud of that. Very proud of that.
Ian Menard, I want to ask you a little bit more about the ACLU's approach to defending minorities like Iranian Americans and how it's engaged with the Iranian American community and organizations thus far, and lessons learned from that and how we can improve on it.
So I think you all already know this, but I'm Iranian American myself. I'm very proud of being American. I'm very proud of being Iranian American, and I'm very proud of the fact that in this country we have freedom to form organizations and associations and use our freedom of speech. I've read over the First Amendment many times recently, and it's a beautiful amendment. The First Amendment starts with the freedom of religion, which is really about our freedom of conscience and our beliefs and our values. And then it goes to the freedom of speech, which is our ability to express our values. And then the freedom of assembly, to come together in rooms like this and be in association with each other, whether in person or through live stream or through associations.
Don't forget the freedom of the press.
And the freedom of the press, it actually is between those two, which is our ability to broadcast our views. And it all culminates in the right to petition the government for a redress of our grievances. So it starts at the level of our innermost values, and then it expresses itself in our relationship to government. It's really pretty amazing when you look at it as a whole. And that's not my idea. It's a book by a wonderful author, so just for now. So what I want to just say is that it's so important for Iranian Americans to act on our values, to express ourselves through our freedom of speech, through the freedom of the press, through associations, and to petition government. So the ACLU, one thing is people associate the ACLU with lawyers, so they think that you have to be a lawyer to be a part of the ACLU. I'm not a lawyer, and I run the ACLU of Northern California. So the ACLU is welcoming of every person from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and as we said earlier, in every state. And the ACLU works alongside groups like Iranian American Bar Association, PAAIA, NIAC, other Iranian ethnic groups in collaboration with you, as we do with, for example, the NAACP, which for over 100 years has been one of the core organizations defending the rights not just of African Americans, but of many communities. So it's really important to have associations that are by your ethnic group or national group or religious group, because there are a lot of issues that are unique to groups, but it's also important to have groups like the ACLU that will defend the rights of all people, and then for us to collaborate. So what the ACLU does is a few things. One is we go to court, and as we did within hours of the Muslim ban, we advocate with Congress and with executive agencies. Right now, we have to, mainly our only advocacy that we can do with federal government is probably going to be in the courts. But we also work at the state and local level, just as Nassim talked about earlier. So those are a few of our strategies, but I just want to say how important it is that we have such vibrant Iranian American groups now, and why we're so excited to be working in partnership at the ACLU with those groups, both at the national level and also in the states.
So I'll just add a little to that. There's not actually a lot more to add. But I'll just say, you know, so I'm a new addition to the ACLU in the DC National Office. I've been on board a little over 2 months, and part of the purpose of my job is, you know, to kind of work on issues, the intersection of issues that impacts particular people, because there's so much overlap. And that's not to say there's not similarities in other communities, but there is a uniqueness, as Alfie was saying, when we think about other pockets of immigration, when we think about ways that that the government might be trying to get around the Muslim ban. I heard a story. I talked to an Iranian couple about a month ago, and it was a couple that was getting married, and the bride was Iranian, and the husband was white, and not a single one of her family members was granted their visa to come into the country for her wedding, and her mom's come every year for years. I think, you know, we don't know the true depth of that, but we've definitely heard a lot of stories about visa denials. We've seen the government targeting Somali and Iraqi communities for removals. They're using removal orders that are already in place, that have been in place for years at this point, but these are communities that weren't being sent back because of issues that you might imagine in their home country, so we don't know how they will be targeting other communities. We saw the extreme vetting questions that recently came out that target particular communities. And then similarly, I think in the national security frame, Iranian organizations face the same threats as other organizations in Arab, Muslim, South Asian communities, Middle Eastern communities when it comes to possible Muslim Brotherhood designation. You don't really know who will get swept up in that. And then I also think, you know, in the hate crimes context, in the countering violent extremism context, these are pieces that we all have to be watching for the Iranian communities, but also for other communities, in order to really keep track of what's happening and be able to get a hold on it, because everything is happening so quickly, and it's difficult to pay attention to everything that's going on and all the different policies that are being announced. And I say that to say one of the other ways in which it's possible to engage with the ACLU that I think is really helpful. So the other part of my role is really to engage with communities and to make sure the communities have access to the ACLU National. And so that's part of why, you know, when Abdi reached out to me wanting to do this, I very much wanted to do it. I want to be able to connect with you all, with other people in your community, with communities around the country, so that we can actually understand what's happening on the ground, and so that when you need help, we're here along with our partners. And those stories, we can't, those are community member stories, so we don't know what's happening on the ground unless people are sharing their stories with us. And so that's a big part, I think, of the role you can play as well.
Thank you. We're going to go a little deeper into the actual case, the travel ban case right now, and speak about that a bit. As many of you know, the President unleashed a furious tirade of Twitter tweets this morning in favor of his originally proposed travel ban, calling what his administration sent to the Supreme Court a watered down and politically correct version of his original plan. Following that up with people, the lawyers and the courts can call it whatever they want, but I am calling it what we need and what it is, a travel ban. Now, organizations like PAAIA, IABA, and others that are involved, I believe deeply that we must balance our civil liberties and civil rights against legitimate security needs. And that's been one of the issues at the heart of this case, whether this ban would make us safer or not. Fareed Zakaria recently noted that 94–95% of acts of terror that have been committed have been not from any of the countries involved that are banned in this travel ban, but come, you know, inspired by the Salafi Wahhabi vision of Islam, which was a fringe vision of it that has been exported for the last 40 years. But more about your thoughts on how to balance these interests of civil liberties and national security, but also tell us about the Fourth Circuit's recent decision as well, and bring us up to date.
Sure. I believe that if there was a legitimate national security basis for this travel ban, Iranian Americans would be right there supporting it. But because we know it's completely irrational from a national security, it's really about exploiting people's economic insecurities or other insecurities. It's not about national security, and we know that because the government of Iran has been at odds with the U.S. for decades in various levels. But for decades, thousands and thousands of Iranian Americans, tens of thousands have come without any incident. Iranians come to the U.S. without any incidents of terrorism in the U.S., and that's been documented by the Cato Institute, which in our PARS equality case here in federal court, we brought to that court's attention. We also, in cases around the country, national security experts have pointed out that there's no national security justification for this. The president's own Department of Homeland Security had reports in response to his questions that designating people by a class of people by their national origin does not advance the cause of national security, so it doesn't have that kind of basis. But let me turn to the Fourth Circuit case, which we're not litigators on, but the ACLU and other organizations are, but I read it with great interest. So the first majority opinion is written by Judge Gregory, who is one of my heroes on the federal appellate court bench. And he declared that travel ban as unconstitutional based on the Establishment Clause, but he very carefully discussed the leading case that the government was citing, which is a case called Mandel, which is about whether or not you should have deference on national security grounds for individual decisions about individual people. And he pointed out that you can reconcile that with the establishment law cases, particularly this Lemon case, which is the leading case, and you can look at what is the purpose of this travel ban. And you can look at if it has a discriminatory purpose, it's unlawful under that beautiful First Amendment that you just heard about, what he didn't say, but I think is kind of ironic, is that a lot of the inspiration for that First Amendment came from Cyrus the Great and the Cyrus Cylinder century or thousands of years ago, because Thomas Jefferson found that to be one of his inspirations for the Declaration of Independence and for the First Amendment on the Establishment Clause in particular, because of its emphasis on religious tolerance, and that's one of the great ironies in all of this. But then, as important as Chief Judge Gregory's majority opinion is the concurrences. There are three concurrences, each of which bring out new, interesting aspects. One by Judge Keenan, she pointed out that actually there's a statutory grounds to hold it unlawful on a point that I hadn't actually given enough thought to, which is that under the INA, the statute that we talked about that was transformed in the 1960s, you need to make, as a government, a finding before you start to exclude people from coming to this country. And they never made that kind of finding to justify it. So that was the import of her opinion. Judge Wynn also did kind of a national origin kind of emphasis, a little bit of equal protection. He's kind of alluding to it, but his main point of his concurrence is that when, in the Constitution, it's Congress that decides the immigration laws. They then delegated that to the president, and when they delegated that, of course they did not mean that you could violate fundamental principles of constitutional law. You could discriminate against people. So that in that delegation was an inherent limit that was violated. And then the third concurrence, Judge Thacker, she wrote that you don't need to look at all the history of all the President Trump's campaign speeches. You can look at what he said about the travel ban since he became president. And he has some new tweets today that help underscore this. So that's, I thought all those three were very interesting. There were 3 dissents. Each of the dissents, the first 2 of them basically said, hey, courts, close your eyes, be blind about anything the president does on national security. And then the third one questioned the standing of the sole plaintiff in that case that was used for standing, which was a family reunification issue, John Doe 1, who was trying to reunite with his wife. And so he raised questions on that. Once that was decided, then like 2 or 3 days later, the Department of Justice went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which was about to issue a decision. They went to our case here in D.C., and they're trying to stay the cases and try to get the Supreme Court to only hear this Fourth Circuit case in an expedited basis. And they asked for briefing on June 14th. So I think later this month, the Supreme Court will decide whether to take this case on an emergency basis over the summer or to go through the natural progression of letting different lower courts opine on different aspects of the cases and then try to resolve it in the normal course, which would be sometime in the next Supreme Court term next year.
Thank you, Cyrus. I'm going to go a little deeper on that with you. The President referred to Section 212 of the Immigration Naturalization Act, which was from 1952, and cited, which says, whenever the President finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation and for such period as he deems necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate. The 65 Act amended it, adding the language of Section 202 that says, no person shall receive any preference or priority or be discriminated against in the issuance of an immigrant visa because of the person's race, sex, nationality, place of birth, or place of residence. Can you just speak a little bit more about your views on the interrelation between Section 212 of the INA and Section 202, and whether it could be expanded to apply to citizens and their relatives who basically can't discriminate against the relatives of citizens based on national origin as well?
Okay, well, that's kind of 2 questions. The first one is, and these are great questions, is a statutory construction issue. When you have a law passed in 1952 that says, hey, President, you can declare to exclude people, and then you have a law passed in 1964 which says, well, wait a minute, you can't discriminate based on national origin, religion, and so forth. How do you reconcile those 2? Well, traditional statutory construction is that the second statute restricts and amends the earlier statute. So that's why the INA claim has such a strong basis. And again, I refer you to Judge Keenan's concurrence out of the Fourth Circuit case. But then let's turn to what do we do, and this has always been one of the issues from the beginning of these various cases around the country trying to take on the travel ban, is that a lot of people that are injured are aliens of the United States who don't have rights like Americans have rights, or green card holders have rights, or even people with a visa in their hands have rights. So what we've tried to do in developing our case here in D.C. is that there's a D.C. Circuit Court case that you can look at American, even Mandel, the case the Justice Department loves so much, that you can look at people, U.S. citizens' rights in tandem with the aliens. So, for example, you have, in that case, Mandel, there was faculty who wanted a speaker from abroad to come to the U.S., and he was denied. And part of it was basically breaking the rules with his prior visa. But they had standing because the rights of the faculty were impacted, and so they were U.S. citizens. But when we looked at our case, and the reason why it's so important that PARS Equality, IABA, PAAIA, and NIAC united, is that they are Iranian-American organizations that have standing under civil rights jurisprudence, and that their rights of Americans are being impacted. So, for example, we have 25 individual plaintiffs, 5 of which are people who have weddings, like you just mentioned, that have been disrupted. Their fiancés trying to get here, their parents trying to get here, and there's often a mix of U.S. citizens and foreign nationals trying to get here for the wedding. Well, that combined with the individuals, with the organizations, makes the most powerful case for standing. Or take refugees, which are not, the refugee provision is not in the Fourth Circuit case, but is in the Ninth Circuit case and in our case here in D.C. Our position is, and our judge asked us this question, is that the organizations, particularly in this instance, Partners Equality, which does a lot of work on refugees, combined with the refugees from abroad, that's how you get standing. So that's answering the second question.
Fair enough. Just for everybody's benefit, I'll just read what Senator Kennedy, the architect of the 1965 law, said.
Ted Kennedy?
Ted Kennedy, yes. There's a number of Senator Kennedys. He said, it was intended to eliminate the national origin system, which was conceived in a period of bigotry and reaffirmed in the McCarthy era. And President Johnson, when signing it, added that this bill says simply that from this day forth, those wishing to immigrate to America shall be admitted on the basis of their skills and their close relationship to those already here. This system that we had violated the basic principle of American democracy, the principle that values and rewards each man on the basis of their merit as a man. Today, with my signature, this system is abolished. So it's a very important piece of legislative history, and it inspires all of us. I want to go to a darker period, that of a case that I'm sure some of you have heard of, called Korematsu. And in the Supreme Court's infamous 1944 Japanese internment decision, Korematsu versus the United States, has never been overturned. But does that mean, as some of President Trump's associates have suggested and implied, that it is still good law, a precedent that could be cited in support of a national registry for Muslims, or other morally repugnant classification schemes or internment schemes, with the repeat of one act of terror after the other, again, always seem to be tied to the Wahhabi Salafist strain of Islam, but the general public's discussion being one of it's Islam, and people have suggested maybe internment during time of war is not a bad idea. Do you think, when the Supreme Court takes up the Fourth Circuit's opinion, decision, that it provides an opportunity for them to finally overturn and eliminate Korematsu as a decision?
Well, Judge Wynn in the Fourth Circuit case did mention the Korematsu case and cited the dissent, which in history, the dissent is what is acclaimed, and everyone recognizes, pretty much everyone, that Korematsu was wrongly decided. I'm not sure if the Fourth Circuit case is the right vehicle to overturn it, because it's based so much on establishment clause, not on national origin. But I do think our Partners Equality case, which has equal protection and national origin as a focus, would be a great vehicle if we could get to that point. But I would not be surprised, regardless of what happens in the Supreme Court, someone will mention Korematsu either in the oral argument or in one of the opinions. But it would be wonderful if it could finally be overturned. And there's a Korematsu Institute. The daughter is very much aligned with the Iranian American community and has been supportive of everything. NIAC has been supportive of IABA, and so she's a wonderful person, and it's a good person, good ally for us in the long term.
Abdi, if you want to comment on that a bit more.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
But I also want to add to that for you and Manar and Ali. We've heard a lot about the discriminatory travel ban that's based on national origin. What are some of the other issues Iranian Americans should be vigilant about? And so we can expand the conversation.
Manar, why don't you take that, and then I'll follow it with
So, I know we want to get to Q&A, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, because I've touched on a lot of these already. But I would say, when we're thinking about, there's, beyond the Muslim ban, there is the written Muslim ban, and then there is what I was saying is kind of like the immigration pieces that we're seeing that might have the result of a Muslim ban, right? When we're talking about who is let into the country, we're talking about the extreme vetting questions. They called them supplemental vetting questions in their publication. But they, you know, they ask about, they go back 15 years in terms of employment history, travel history, histories of residences. That's longer than we go back for national security clearances in government. And we're gonna go back longer, like that's like 7 or 10 years, I think, and we're gonna go 15 years for people applying for visas. And also when they ask about travel, they're also asking for the source of funding for every domestic and international trip. Can you imagine, like, every trip that you've taken for the last 15 years to say where your funding came from, and then there's no parameters as to how they're gonna make the determination of who is a threat based on that. So there's no, and then there's also social media questions that go back 5 years asking for people's handles, which are also incredibly problematic for visa applicants, but also for US residents and citizens whose information is gonna be caught up in that by virtue of just being connected with somebody online. And so they're gonna be storing that data, we don't know for how long. I mean, I think just quickly in the sum of the extreme vetting questions, I think the problem is we don't know anything about, they published a notice in the Federal Register with the questions, and they've given us no information about how they're going to use that information, how they're gonna store that data, how they're gonna determine who's a threat. There's absolutely no guidelines or parameters that they've given us, which creates an environment that is just ripe for discrimination. And so we're gonna have to watch very closely to see who's impacted by that. And then I also mentioned the Somali and Iraqi removals, and I think we're gonna have to, you know, we don't know exactly, there are policies around where ICE is supposed to go to pick up people, like they're not supposed to go to places that are called sensitive locations, which are faith-based institutions, schools. There's about 4 or 5 places that they're not supposed to go to with their policies, and we don't know how long those will be in place. So, you know, we're always looking very closely to see if any of those policies are violated. And then I think in the profiling and surveillance space, that's a space that we need to be very conscious of and aware of. We've seen in LA and in New York over the, you know, in the post 9/11 years up until very recently, and there's still litigation going on about it, the surveillance of certain communities by local law enforcement. So the NYPD was surveilling colleges and universities who had like Muslim student organizations. They were going to mosques, they were going to community neighborhoods and stores and just gathering data and spying on people. And so I think we have to think about that in the context of the current environment. I mean, the administration has said that they will use, that they don't have a, that I should say, President Trump, it hurts me to say those words, President Trump has said that he doesn't see a problem with basically spying on these communities. And then that also ties into things like countering violent extremism, where historically the government has gone to mosques and community-based institutions to make connections with local communities. And then lastly, I think the hate crimes, and also with our youth, we need to be watching in the bullying space. There's a lot of stuff happening in schools that's been happening for some time now. But I'm definitely hearing increasingly in the last several months about children being harassed in school, sometimes by teachers. There was a kid whose hijab was pulled off by a teacher, like just in the last few weeks. And we need to hold our educational institutions accountable and make sure that they are upholding the right of all of these young people to achieve their education.
Before we go to Q&A, Abdi or Ali, do you want to add anything on these points or on the case itself?
Just I want to touch on Korematsu question very quick.
Sure.
In Korematsu case, there were a totally different situation, and the situation is different because there were congressional approval. And Justice Black, Chief Justice Black at the time, pretty much built upon the fact that the Congress itself actually approved this. I'm not saying this to suggest that if Congress approves the ban, we should do that. This is a very bad decision. We know Korematsu case was a bad decision, and it's one of the very few cases that the government satisfies the strict scrutiny standard. But I think even if this goes to the Supreme Court, and even if the Supreme Court wants to use that case, they're not going to pass. This is not going to pass the strict scrutiny standard because there's there are much differences between this case and Korematsu, and also the time is a different time. That was during World War II. We have come a long way in civil rights and protecting civil rights of our citizens since World War II. Also, I wanted to say that Iranian American community is maybe one of the newer communities in America that's trying to stand for itself. There are many different types of discrimination against this community. We are seeing more hate crimes happening. We're seeing more hate crimes happening against our community than before, and we have reports of
Or against others who think they're committing against Iranians, but
yes,
go after a
so
Sikh.
it's very interesting that we had a hate crime against a Sikh person, and when they captured the perpetrator, he said, "I thought he's Iranian." And we have discriminatory treatment at workplace, employment discrimination. We have harassment in schools or other places, First Amendment and religious intolerance and targeting of this community through vehicles of national security and intelligence community. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up here is I want everyone in our community to talk to others and report these incidences to one of these organizations that are very active. For example, we are, IABA is open to get all these reports and try to act upon them. I'm very much sure that other organizations or American organizations are open to at least the receiving of the reports. So stand up for yourself, talk to others, talk to lawyers, and be sure that the Iranian American community is here to help you and to stand for itself. And also, I want to add again that it's time for us to make sure that other minority groups receive some support from us. And that's very helpful because they're going to support us at a time of need as well.
Unfortunately, we're going to lose Cyrus because he has to go to his daughter's graduation party.
No, it's a dinner before the graduation. But anyway, thank you all for being here.
Yeah, just to, for the Q&A, we're going to end the live stream in a minute. So I just want to close this segment by thanking everybody who's here in the room, but also thanking everybody who's watching the live stream. And if there's one main point that we want you to leave with, it's that this is the time for Iranian Americans to be involved in the defense of constitutional rights, both as they affect us, but as they affect every person in this country. And please, get involved in either an Iranian American organization. If there's not a chapter of a local Iranian American group, the national groups are there to be your partner. And to reach out to the ACLU, and you can do that at aclu.org, or you can contact the ACLU in your home state, and we have to work hand in hand together to defend everybody's rights.
I'm going to underscore that as well. Join both the ACLU and PAAIA and IABA if you're an attorney. Get involved, because unless we get involved, we will lose the rights that we have. Bad things will happen. So as a community, I know we're learning how important this is. It's been a real wake-up call, but I'm also very optimistic. And just realize this sort of organizing and engagement doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, so be patient. There's ups and downs, but we will overcome, and the United States will overcome. It always does. So let's go to Q&A now.
We're just going to pause for a second to close out the live stream.